What does Lacan mean in his references to perversion? Many of us will be familiar with this idea that in Lacanian psychoanalysis, we've got three basic, fundamental, I suppose, subjective structures or diagnostic structures. We are frequently told that there's three, and for each of them, we have a fundamental defensive procedure or response. We have foreclosure in psychosis, we have repression in neurosis, and so we are told we have disavowal in cases of perversion. Now, we can ask some questions about this, particularly given the number of debates that are happening and have happened over the years in the Lacanian world as to whether this notion of perversion even deserves its own structure. In the subsequent lectures that will follow on from this one, we'll spend a lot of time on that question, and we'll ask about the merits of why perversion might be considered a diagnostic structure, and in what respects that idea could be contested. So there's much to say about it. I just want to signal that debate from the outset. But what we'd like to focus on here is clearly Lacan does use the term and has a fair amount to say about what he considers perversion. So we're going to think that through in a series of mini lectures, and our fundamental reference point will be this kind of formula, you could say, I suppose, of perversion when Lacan insists that the perverse subject makes themselves the instrument of the other's jouissance. And of course, there's variations on this assertion. The subject makes themselves the object, instruments of the other's anxiety or jouissance. We find it in different variations in different texts, but that's the basic foundation that we will seek to explore. We will need to take a little bit of time and question and open up for a certain amount of examination each of the key fundamental terms here. What does it mean to be the subject who makes themselves an object, for example? What does it mean when one talks about the object instrument? And what does it mean to be the object of the others, the big others, jouissance? Presumably, it means that one will be an object or an instrument, a vehicle of not just another's pain or jouissance, but of the big other jouissance. And that's one of the nuances of this formula of sorts that we'll need to explore. So we'll go on to do that. We should also, just by way of introduction, note some of the controversies that start to accumulate around this notion of perversion, not just whether within the Lacanian field perversion should be accorded, as it were, the dignity of a diagnostic structure, but also questions as to whether this notion is now somewhat antiquated. In a post-Foucauldian world where notions of BDSM sexuality are increasingly considered to be mainstream, where we're kind of invited to, involve ourselves in kink practices and all these things, you could say that perversion, certainly in as much as it entails this connotation of something amoral or problematic, is something that we need, or deviancy from a norm, is something we might want to reconsider. I'll give you my bottom line here. One is we will go and explore some of those debates, but let's just put it this way, whether we call it perversion and whether we are attentive to some of the problematics of that term, it seems to me nevertheless important to get a sense of what Lacan is talking about, how to understand how he utilizes it, and then also to ask the question whether or not we want to accord it the dignity of a diagnostic structure. Maybe it still points to certain important clinical ideas that might be useful in dealing with an area of suffering that seems to have many of the features that Lacan is talking to. So in other words, it's not so much for me fundamentally a question of where do we place it, how must we think about it as fundamentally structural or not, but to ask ourselves how clinically useful the ideas would be. Not so much to have a kind of fundamental categorization of subjects, but to think about how they might help and assist a treatment and the exploration of the modes of sexuality that are presented in this form. So that's our introduction. What we're going to do now is quickly take a few moments in Freud's work. The 3 Essays in Sexuality is a great starting point for this, just so that we can get a sense, which any good Lacanian exposition should do, of some of the basic elements of what Freud means when he talks about perversion. We should also note that in the 3 essays, which published in 1905, is now getting on a little bit, 120 years old, there's moments here when we see Freud at, dare we say it, in his somewhat more radical stance of saying that, bear in mind, when you start to think about perversion, be careful how you do so, because this is a problematic term. I'll give a quote, but he's kind of insistent at a number of times in the essay that what we would want to consider normal sexuality is still, it has, as it were, polymorphous perversity, one of his terms for the kind of base level arrival on the planet dimensions of human sexuality already built within it. Now, of course, people will say that in the three essays we see Freud being both radical and then, as it were, retreating from some of those insights a little bit later. True enough, I guess, but I want to pull out a couple of moments that seem very profitable to us for thinking about perversion. So let's start with Freud pushing back against notions of degeneracy, the whole Krafft-Ebing mode of thinking about sexual degeneracy. Freud doesn't want to do that. And at, let's see, around 75, page 75 of my version of the three essays, which is a section, I'm trying to show it to you, not very well, is a section, The Perversions in General, Freud says this: normal people too can substitute a perversion for the normal sexual aim for quite a time, or can find place for the one alongside the other. And here comes a better point. No healthy person, it appears, can fail to make some addition that might be called perverse to the normal sexual aim. And the universality of this finding is in itself enough to show how inappropriate it is to use the word perversion as a term of reproach. End quote. How inappropriate it is to use the word perversion as a term of reproach. Let's say then, as we move on to think about the implications of how Lacan is understanding this, of this language, of perversion as a potentially diagnostic category, if only we could keep Freud's phrase reverberating for us. How inappropriate it is to use this word as a term of reproach, even if that's implicitly done rather than explicitly. But nevertheless, let's go back to see what the other implications of his idea. No healthy person can fail to make some addition that might be called perverse to the normal sexual aim. Why is it important that he says that? Well, earlier on, he wants to give us a provisional definition of perversion. There's a kind of almost a little bit of a Freudian undoing of a former assertion. Earlier on in the text, he says, perversions are sexual activities which either extend in an anatomical sense beyond regions of the body that are designed for sexual union, or B, that linger over the intermediate relations to the sexual object, which should normally be traversed rapidly on the path towards the final sexual aim. So in this earlier description of perversion, he's pretty much thinking perversion in its relationship to, let's say, procreative heterosexual sexuality. That seems to be the implication here. But perversions are thereby to be defined by or identified if there is something that's involved an anatomical part of the body or an anatomical region beyond the most obvious sexual genital areas of procreation, number one, and whether there's a lingering of intermediate relations to the sexual object. So whether that is a physical spatial distancing from genital sexuality, I suppose we could say, or whether it is this lingering of intermediate relations. One is a relationship of a different facet of the body, an anatomically different facet to what would be obviously sexual. The other is a kind of lingering of intermediate relations, which makes one wonder, well, what would that be? Is this some kind of activity precursory to sex? And I guess so, which seems to suggest that all sorts of things, not merely foreplay, but anything that is precursory to sex and which could potentially replace the sexual act as such, is by default considered to be perverse. So we've got that description there, but of course then 10 pages later, Freud is going to say, well, basically all of us do that in some or other way. Okay, so let us move on. He does also, after talking about the problematic resonance of this term perversion, he does want to suggest that if we are dealing with perversion, we will find that the characteristics of exclusiveness and fixation are involved. In other words, there's a sense that this new activity, whether it is some kind of attraction to or masturbatory function over a shoe or something of this sort, if that is now sufficient, where libido becomes stuck, becomes fixated, that is the only domain of sexuality, or if it is the domain that is much more preferred and kind of de-necessitates other forms of sexuality, then we're in the domain of perversion for Freud. But then comes the crucial moment, and he makes this remark a couple of times during the text, at least two, maybe three actually. He says, neuroses are to say the negative of perversions. Neuroses are the negative of perversions. I would like to encourage us to think about how we could employ that characterization in different ways, how we could think it through. It's almost like with that note, we have one of these Lacanian maxims, one of these Lacanian aphorisms. There is no sexual relation. That we can think about, apply, interpret, utilize in a number of different kinds of context. In other words, maybe the implication of this is not simply the most obvious, but let's just keep it in mind. Neuroses are to say the negative of perversions. One implication of that, well, let me give the broader quote. Okay, neuroses are to say the negative of perversions. The sexual drives of neurotics exhibit all the aberrations which we have studied as variations of normal and as manifestations of abnormal sexual life. Okay, so excuse the normal and abnormal stuff there, but basically the point seems to be you will have, you're able to see in the, let's say, the clinic of the perverse, something like that. All of the sexual activities or the sexual enactments or scenes that are actually performed within the domain of perversion are, in a sense, also potentially apparent within the neurotic subject, with the crucial caveat that they are repressed, inhibited, substituted for, displaced, avoided at some level. So you could say that there's the same underpinnings, it's just that they take a different form, essentially a negative form, a repressed form. So one further implication of this, neuroses are to say the negative of perversions, is that it has a little bit of an implication in terms of the subjective or diagnostic structures we spoke about before. Instead then of thinking maybe a kind of three-column side-by-side series of basic Lacanian clinical structures, psychosis, neurosis, perversion, we might then want to say, well, could you not in fact have two, which indeed is what some Lacanians are arguing for, and say essentially we have a kind of binary clinic. We have psychosis, but then we have psychosis and we have neurosis. We don't consider perversion its own clinical subjective structure, but in this column, so to speak, of neurosis, you would have neurosis as itself the negative of a further category of which it is the negativization, in other words, perversion. Put differently then, you could imagine how you would have one category of psychosis as a clinical diagnostic structure. Then we have neurosis, which is kind of the flip side itself of perversion. Again, it's a point we'll come back to, but just to reiterate that quote once again, the unconscious life of all neurotics, without exception, shows inverted impulses. Let's also quickly note an interesting footnote that Freud includes on the bottom of the same page when he first asserts this idea that neuroses are to say the negative of perversions. So I'll read it. It's a little wordy, so I'll read it first and then we'll come back to it. But the reason I want to put it forward here is that what essentially Freud is doing is a kind of differential diagnostic. He gives us a similar phenomena. He says this is how it occurs in perverse subject. This is how it occurs in paranoics, in other words, psychotic subjects, and this is how it occurs in hysterics, in other words, neurotic subjects. So it's an interesting kind of differential diagnostic for us because we see the same sexual impulse, the same sexual drive, as it would take different forms in these structures. So here's the quote. It's, I think it's on my text. It's on about page 80. And here's the quote. He says, it's footnote, the contents of the clearly conscious fantasies of perverse subjects or the delusional fears of paranoics, which are projected into a hostile sense onto other people, and the unconscious fantasies of hysterics, all of these coincide with one another, even down to their details. What? So another way of saying that is, let's imagine that we've got someone who's perverse, someone who is hysterical, and someone who's paranoid. And then we ask ourselves, well, each of these persons, for the sake of the argument, has the same impulse, the same sexual impulse. And let's say that this impulse is something that's not considered particularly acceptable in the time and place that they're having it. What do they each do? Well, we have the conscious fantasy of the perverse subject. It's a nice conjunction, conscious fantasies, rather than the more repressed fantasies of the neurotic. We have the conscious fantasy of the perverse subject, who presumably will go on, if opportunity permits, to actually enact this sexual drive, this sexual aim, as opposed to what we'd find in the case of the paranoid subject. The paranoid subject has a different way of dealing with things. They project, in a hostile sense, this impulse onto other people. And of course, you could say that presumably one of Freud's, when he's writing this footnote, I'm not sure of the exact date he puts it in, but presumably there's an implicit reference to Schreber, who has a homosexual urge, which at his time and place is considered not particularly viable, I guess. Got a homosexual urge, I want to do something with another man. This is unacceptable. It's not repressed because Schreber is psychotically structured. Rather, it's fundamentally foreclosed, or to use the terms that Freud is using here, it's projected. It's projected onto someone else, and it's also given a negative form. That's why he says a hostile sense. So for Schreber, the exact same impulse that is enacted by the perverse subject is now received from the outside in a hostile form. It's not that I want to sleep with another man and do this to him. Rather, that guy wants to do something to me, and the thing he wants to do is fundamentally hostile. It's kind of the sexual thing has become negativized, turned into a hostility. And that's how I realize the same thing. Those two variations on the same underpinning sexual impulse finds a third form in the hysterical subject, who, Freud says, and as we have heard, they have the same thing, but it is manifest in a series of repressed symptoms. All of these coincide with one another, even down to their details. So it's a nice comparative sense of how the same fundamental impulse would be realized in different types of suffering. Let's end then with a very interesting note to stress. Freud does say such symptoms involve suffering. I know I already mentioned it, but it's just important clinically, I think, to bear that in mind. It's not simply, although it may in addition be this, it's not simply that the perverse subject gets off on another's pain. Presumably that can happen, but that itself should be seen as in relationship to a form of suffering, an important point. We'll end then with 2 points that Freud makes. This notion that I've tried to highlight about neurosis being the negative of a perversion is again reiterated later on in the text when Freud makes this fascinating reference. He speaks of hysterics as negative perverts. Interestingly, we could ask, why doesn't he also speak about obsessionals like that? But particularly the reference is to hysterics as negative perverts, presumably because the sexual symptoms, the sexual repression that's involved, that comes back in various forms in hysteria, makes it a better match for the negativization of perversion. But nevertheless, just to highlight that, hysterics as negative perverts, I wonder how that opens up clinical opportunities for us in thinking about case material, for example. So that's the one thing I wanted to emphasize. And then this fascinating quote that I wanted to give you, there's one of the most amazing sections in the 3 essays is when Freud is talking about the scopic drive. And this scopic drive, the visuality, the eye, the seeing, will be something, of course, that Lacan will pick up on. We'll give an example of it later on. It's kind of an exemplary instance of Freud thinking about sexuality in less than obvious forms. But after talking about that, he makes this comment. In scopophilia, okay, the libidinalized dimension of looking, in scopophilia and exhibitionism, okay, like exhibitionism, exposing oneself, in scopophilia and exhibitionism, the eye corresponds to an erotogenic zone. While in the case of these components of the sexual instincts which involve pain and cruelty, the same role is assumed by the skin. The skin, which in particular parts of the body has become differentiated into sex organs or modified into mucous membrane and is thus the erotogenic zone par excellence. So a couple of things to pick up on there. we're so used to the standard Freudian libidinal objects and zones, anality, orality, so on and so forth. It's just interesting to see that Freud himself is quite aware that those aren't always the only ones. So great point. Thank you, Freud. And particularly this fascinating idea that the I corresponds to an erotogenic zone. The I corresponds to an erotogenic zone. George Bataille, of course, has a whole book of erotic stuff about the I, but let's just stay with that notion. The I itself is an erotogenic zone. And of course, you would say that seems fairly obvious, maybe in exhibitionism and voyeurism, where visuality has become fundamentally sexualized. But let's just stay with that. Freud's point seems to go beyond simply saying that there could be eroticization of, sexualization of looking and seeing, which is a very fundamental part of sexuality, to saying that the I might itself be an erotogenic zone. There seems to be further implications to think about that. Again, it's a point we'll return to. And then this subsequent point, those components of the sexual drive which involve pain and cruelty, the same role is assumed by the skin. In other words, the skin becomes an erotogenic zone. Now, you could say that that's kind of by default necessarily the case for sexuality or human sexuality that involves bodies, which is quite a lot of human sexuality, but it becomes an erotogenic zone, particularly for instances of masochism and sadism. So those are some crucial points to ponder. We'll return to highlight some of the Lacanian facets of that material, and particularly this notion that when we are dealing with so-called perversion, we're fundamentally dealing with the ground zero level of sexuality per se.